This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. While that's what we normally do, sometimes we also look at the worst cards ever, and that's what we're doing today. Over the last several weeks, I've taken a look at the worst 1-drop and 2-drop creatures, and we're continuing with that theme today by looking at the worst 3-drop creatures. These types of lists aren't as data-driven as the ones that look at the best cards, and ultimately the cards that appear on this list and where they rank is based on my opinion, but I do use some data to help me make my selections. A card wasn't considered for this list if it has ever been successful at high-level Magic events, or if it's widely played in EDH. I use EDH Rec for the EDH side of things because they have a massive database of decks. Alright, let's get started with a look at the 10 worst 3-drop creatures ever. At number 10, it is Androdite Leech. This has Grey Ogre stats. In other words, it's a 3-mana 2/2. That stat line is generally not very good without some upside, and that's true for pretty much all of Magic's history. And it comes with a pretty hefty downside here. It makes your black spells cost 1 additional black mana. Now, it does also come with some upside. You can pay a single black mana to give it +1/+1 until end of turn, but you're going to have access to less of that mana because of the Leech itself. This means the ideal thing to do, I guess, is to stop casting your spells and pump all of your mana into Androdite Leech every turn, since your spells are suddenly a lot harder to cast. But putting all of your eggs in that basket sounds absolutely horrible, since you do it at the cost of not developing your board. And sure, you could play it in a deck that doesn't have any other black spells, but then that means you don't have the black mana to pump this in the first place, so what are you even doing? So, yeah, the upside here is minimal, and the downside is absolutely massive. At number 9, it's Sea Troll. This doesn't even get to 3-mana 2/2, it's only a 2/1, and its text box is completely irrelevant in way too many situations. It can regenerate for a single blue, but only if it interacted in combat with a blue creature. That really diminishes how good regeneration can be, since it won't work against removal, and it's just irrelevant against most creatures. At number 8, I've got Homarid. I think I'm going to get some hate mail about this one because there are some people out there who love them some Homarids, but this card's terrible. It has tide counters that have an effect on how big the creature is. For example, the turn you play it, it's a 3-mana 1/1 because it has 1 tide counter from entering the battlefield. Then the next turn, it's a 2/2. And then the turn after that, it's a 3/3. But then it goes back to being a 2/2 and then back to being a 1/1. So your maximum upside here is a 3-mana 3/3. But this has the massive downside of not being that very often, and in fact, it's only a 1/1 for 3 mana a decent chunk of the time. At number 7, it's Shore Snapper. This 3-mana 2/2 comes with the upside of gaining Island Walk for a single blue mana. The idea here is to hate on blue decks some, but you're not exactly doing anything impressive by making your 2/2 unblockable conditionally for a specific mana cost. And the fact it costs a different color of mana matters too, as that reduces the chances you'll be able to even take advantage of the upside consistently, and the upside is mostly non-existent. At number 6, I've got Taoist Mystic. Like Shore Snapper, this is a Grey Ogre with super narrow upside. It can't be blocked by creatures who have Horsemanship. That's even more narrow than Island Walk because Horsemanship only showed up in a single set, Portal 3 Kingdoms, a set where Horsemanship filled in for flying and worked pretty much the same way. A Horsemanship creature can't be blocked by creatures who don't have Horsemanship. So, the funny thing here is that even if you modified this card and switched out Horsemanship for flyers, that it couldn't be blocked by flyers, it would still not be a very good card because of the bad stat line and the narrow ability. But with Horsemanship, it's even more narrow. So basically, this only has upside against a barely used mechanic, and the upside it does have isn't that impressive anyway. At number 5, I've got Grey Ogre. I've mentioned this card a few times already, because many of the cards on it have the same stat line. It's the original 3-mana 2/2, so it has become Magic shorthand for any 3-mana 2/2. Obviously, it doesn't have any downside, but there's no upside either. And a vanilla 3-mana 2/2 is pretty bad. Sometimes you'll hear people say this used to be pretty good, and while it is true that in the early days of Magic this wasn't as bad because creatures were worse overall, Grey Ogre was still pretty awful in the early days of Magic. Once competitive Magic was born in 1994, no one was ever playing a vanilla 3-mana 2/2 because it was just way below rate even then, and it's even truer now. At number 4, I've got Ceremonial Guard. This is the only creature on the list with above rate stats. It's a 3 mana 3/4, but the downside it comes with is absolutely massive, since it can only attack or block a single time, and then it gets sacrificed at the end of combat when it does one of those things. That means it doesn't really take advantage of its stat line. If you're wanting to attack, your opponent can just take it, since they don't have to use a removal spell on it and it's going to go away. If they have a large creature that can just block it, that's even more awful. It's even worse on defense though, because it dies even if it has to block a 1/1 or something. At number 3, it is Flow of Maggots. Yet another Grey Ogre, and this one has some upside. Only walls can block it. That's some real upside for sure, but it's completely erased by the massive downside that is cumulative upkeep. You have to pay an increasing amount of mana every turn to keep this around, so it quickly becomes not efficient at all. The turn after you play it, you have to pay 1 mana, then 2 mana, then 3 mana, then 4, and a mostly unblockable 2/2 really isn't worth the cost, even the first time you have to pay for this. At number 2, I've got Mindless Null, a 3 mana 2/2 that has a text box that is all downside. It can't block unless you control a vampire. This one's kind of funny because the fact it's a 3 mana 2/2 is actually the result of a mistake. The designers sent this to the printer with the idea that it would be a 2 mana 2/2 with this downside, but things got mixed up and it ultimately was printed as a 3 mana card. Obviously a 2 mana 2/2 with this downside wouldn't be good, but it would be way better than what was actually printed. This is not the vampire payoff you're looking for. And at number 1, I've got Saprazan Raider. It not only has below rate stats, it has a text box that is pretty much entirely downside. Anytime it gets blocked, you have to return it to your hand. Now, this does mean that it can't die in combat, but it also means your opponent can just block this with anything to get you behind on board and tempo. It basically means enhancing this creature in any way is meaningless since it returns before ever doing damage, and if it's equipped or has counters or auras or whatever, those will go away when it gets bounced. So, yeah, your opponent has no incentive not to just constantly block this. And yes, if you put this in a deck that has various effects for when a creature enters the battlefield, maybe it gets a little bit interesting, but there are quite literally hundreds of other cards that combo better with that sort of strategy than this awful 3 mana 1/2 that does nothing else. Even having one of the most useful creature types in all of Magic doesn't save this from being the worst 3-drop creature ever. Well, those are my picks for the 10 worst 3-drop creatures in Magic history. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at the worst cards ever, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.